I never intended to hurt Mark. I loved him. At least I thought I did. But watching him drift further into unhealthy habits terrified me. Every extra pound he gained felt like a ticking time bomb strapped to his chest. My father's heart attack had been swift and merciless, stealing him from us when I was barely old enough to understand what death meant. I couldn't bear the thought of losing Mark in the same way. Still, the change wasn't easy for either of us. Mark had always been jovial, the life of every gathering, his hearty laugh filling up rooms. But his laughter had started to mask a growing sadness, a self-consciousness he refused to admit. And then there was me, his supposed partner in everything, who had begun to see his weight as a problem I needed to solve. When I first suggested tying our intimacy to his weight loss goals, I framed it as motivation. I thought I was helping him. I laid out the plan one quiet evening over dinner, carefully explaining how we'd reserve intimacy for special occasions. Valentine's Day, our anniversary, and our birthdays. 4 times a year. Mark didn't argue. He simply nodded, though his eyes dimmed in a way I'd never seen before. I told myself it was the shock, that he'd come around once he saw results. And results came, slowly but surely. Watching him shed the weight thrilled me at first. I celebrated every milestone, cheering him on as he stepped off the scale. But as the months passed, I noticed the spark in his eyes was fading. He rarely laughed anymore, and our dinners grew quieter. I told myself it was just a process, the sacrifices we had to make for his health. But the truth was, I began to see the cracks forming between us. On Valentine's Day that first year, when he'd met his initial goal, I expected celebration. Instead, he was distant. When I pressed him, he smiled faintly and assured me he was fine. "It's just a lot," he said. I didn't push further. I was too focused on the bigger picture, on saving him. By the second year, Mark had lost over 100 pounds. Friends and family raved about his transformation, but I saw what they didn't. The subtle way his shoulders sagged, the forced smile he gave me when I complimented him. Then came the night that changed everything. I don't know why I said it, why I let the words slip out. We were arguing about his diet when I blurted, "If you quit now, I'll have to find someone else to meet my needs." I saw the way his head snapped up, his eyes narrowing in shock. I hadn't meant it. Not really. But in that moment, I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. His silence that followed was worse than yelling. For the first time, I realized my plan to save Mark might have been destroying him all along. I should have stopped after that argument. The look in Mark's eyes, shattered, disbelieving, should have been enough to wake me up. But I didn't know how to undo what I'd set into motion. For 2 years, our lives revolved around his weight, his progress, his milestones. At first, I told myself it was about his health, but the truth crept in slowly, a whisper in the back of my mind. I liked the power it gave me. I liked that I could control something in our marriage when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Mark had always been the bigger personality in our relationship. People gravitated toward him. His jokes, his warmth, his charm. I, on the other hand, was quiet, reserved and disciplined. For years, I'd envied how easily he moved through the world, how he could light up a room without trying. But as his weight climbed, that light began to dim, and I felt, what? Pity? Relief? I hate admitting it, but I felt like I was finally the stronger one, the one holding us together. In the beginning, it felt like we were working towards something together. I cheered him on at every weigh-in, cooked his meals with precision, and set out his workout clothes each morning. but over time, his enthusiasm waned. I'd find him sitting in the garage after work, staring at the walls, or sneaking bites of chips when he thought I wasn't looking. "Do you even care?" I snapped at him one night after catching him with a candy bar. His shoulders slumped, and he muttered something about needing a break. I dismissed it. "You're doing this for us," I told him, "for our future." But was he? Or was it all for me? The distance between us grew wider with every pound he lost. On the surface, he was thriving. Compliments from friends, new clothes, a slimmer frame. But behind closed doors, he was a shell of the man I married. He stopped laughing, stopped joking, stopped sharing the little moments of his day. I blamed the diet, the stress, the pressure. Never myself. Until the night everything fell apart. He had reached his goal, 120 pounds lost. I should have been proud, overjoyed, but instead I felt restless. He looked amazing, and people noticed. Women noticed. For the first time in years, I felt insecure. What if he realized he could do better than me? What if he left? That's why I couldn't let him quit. When he told me he was done, that he wanted to stop counting calories and tracking steps, I panicked. "You can't quit," I said sharply. "We've come this far." "We?" he shot back. His tone startled me. "I've done this for you, Grace," he said, his voice rising. "For you. Do you know how hard this has been? The hunger, the exhaustion, the constant pressure?" I didn't know what to say. He looked at me like I was a stranger. "And for what?" he continued. "So you can keep rationing out intimacy like it's some kind of prize? Do you even love me anymore? Or am I just your project?" I panicked. I didn't know how to respond. And that's when I said it. "If you quit now, don't expect me to wait around. I have needs, Mark." The words were out before I could stop them. His face crumbled. Shock, hurt, anger, all at once. "You're threatening me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "No, You are," he interrupted. "You're telling me that if I don't keep punishing myself, you'll go find someone else." I tried to backtrack, but it was too late. The damage was done. He stood there, staring at me like he didn't even know who I was. Then he turned and walked out of the room. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, replaying the argument in my head. I wanted to blame him for being too sensitive, for twisting my words, but deep down I knew the truth. I'd been cruel, selfish, manipulative. I'd pushed him too far, and now I might lose him for good. The next morning he was distant, polite but cold. He didn't touch me, didn't kiss me goodbye. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what I'd done. I'd spent 2 years trying to mold him into the man I thought I wanted. But in the process, I'd destroyed the man I loved. When he came home that evening, I tried to apologize, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said flatly. "I need time to think." He retreated to the garage, and I stayed behind, paralyzed by fear. Fear that he wouldn't forgive me. Fear that I'd already lost him. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound of his footsteps. When he finally came to bed, he didn't say a word. He turned his back to me, and I felt the space between us grow even wider. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't know how to reach him, and I wasn't sure if I ever could. The silence between Mark and me was unbearable. Days passed, and he barely spoke to me. His usual warmth was replaced by a distant, guarded coldness. I tried to bridge the gap with small gestures. His favorite meals, thoughtful questions about his day. But nothing seemed to work. Every time I looked into his eyes, I saw the same unspoken question. Why? I wanted to tell him that he had nothing to worry about, that I had never cheated on him. But how could I say those words without admitting that he had every reason to doubt me? My threat, my carelessness, it had planted seeds of suspicion that I couldn't undo. Mark began spending more time in the garage, tinkering with tools he didn't normally use. At first, I told myself he was just cooling off, but then I noticed his behavior changing. He'd go out more often, coming home late with vague explanations. His phone, once left carelessly on counters and tables, was now always in his pocket. The tables had turned, and I hated how powerless I felt. One evening, I mustered the courage to confront him. "Mark, can we talk?" I asked, as he stood by the sink, rinsing his plate from dinner. He didn't look at me. "About what?" "About us. About what's been happening." He finally turned, his face unreadable. "What's there to talk about, Grace? You made yourself clear." "That's not fair," I said, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean what I said." "But you said it," he snapped, his voice sharp and cutting. And now I can't stop wondering how much of it was true. I wanted to scream, to beg him to believe me, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I watched him walk away, leaving me alone, in the echo of my own mistakes. The next morning, Mark left early for work, but his usual kiss goodbye was missing. Hours later, as I went about my day, I received a call from my beautician, Janine. She confirmed my Friday appointment, and I realized I had mentioned my plan to get a new hairstyle to freshen things up. I hoped it might remind Mark of the woman he fell in love with. But the truth was, it wasn't just for Mark. The idea of looking good for someone else, even fleetingly, had crossed my mind. That thought filled me with shame. Yet I pushed it aside, telling myself it didn't mean anything. By Wednesday, the unease in our home had grown unbearable. Mark left the house in the middle of the day, claiming he was meeting his brother for lunch. I didn't think much of it until I saw him leave with a folder tucked under his arm. Something about the way he moved, quick, deliberate, sent a chill down my spine. Later that evening, he was distant again. His responses clipped and guarded. When he disappeared into the office after dinner, I followed him, only to find the door locked. My heart sank. What was he hiding? As the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes. Mark was watching me more closely, his eyes following me whenever I reached for my phone or stepped outside. He didn't say anything, but the weight of his suspicion was palpable. Then one night, I woke to find his side of the bed empty. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding, and saw the faint glow of his laptop through the office door. The sight of him hunched over the desk, so focused, made me hesitate. I wanted to ask what he was doing, but fear held me back. The next day, Mark seemed oddly calm, even polite. But it wasn't the warm politeness of the man I married. It was calculated, detached. He asked about my plans for the weekend, and I told him about my hair appointment. He nodded, but his expression gave nothing away. By Friday morning, I was a bundle of nerves. I arrived at the salon and tried to focus on Janine's chatter as she worked on my hair. But my mind kept drifting back to Mark. What was he thinking? What was he planning? When I got home, the house was empty. I called his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hours passed, and I paced the living room, replaying every moment of the past week. What if he had left me? What if this was his way of saying he was done? Then, just before dinner, the front door opened. Mark walked in, calm and composed, carrying a bag from one of his favorite takeout places. He set it on the counter and smiled at me, an unsettling smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I thought we could have dinner together," he said. I nodded, unsure of what else to do. As we sat down to eat, he finally spoke. "Grace, do you think you've been honest with me?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said quickly. His smile faded. "Are you sure about that?" The weight of his gaze was unbearable. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "You've been lying to me, Grace," he said quietly. "And I know everything." In that moment, my world crumbled. I didn't know how much he knew or how he had found out. But the look in his eyes told me there was no escaping this. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered. But the lie sounded hollow even to me. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Don't worry, Grace. I'm not here to argue. I just want you to think about this. Every lie you tell me from this point forward will have consequences." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of his words hung heavy in the air. I sat there, frozen, as he stood and left the room, leaving me alone with my guilt, and the crushing realization that the man I had taken for granted was no longer the man I thought I knew. The distance between Mark and me had become unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and every interaction felt heavier than the last. He was no longer the man I once knew, warm, forgiving, full of laughter. Now, every word he said was measured, every glance sharp and deliberate. I could feel it. Something was brewing beneath his calm demeanor, something I wasn't ready to face. Then came the night it all unraveled. Mark came home late, carrying a bag of groceries, which was strange enough. But what threw me off was his announcement. He was cooking dinner. He hadn't made a meal in weeks. Yet here he was, calmly laying out ingredients, as if this were just another day. He said nothing about where he'd been, and I didn't ask. The smell of a lasagna filled the air, my favorite dish. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe this was his way of forgiving me, of trying to bridge the distance that had grown between us. We sat down to eat in silence, the only sound the clinking of silverware on plates. Mark poured us each a glass of wine, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice soft and deliberate. "Grace, do you think you've been honest with me?" The question was like a punch to the stomach. "Of course," I replied quickly, though my voice trembled. He didn't react. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of wine. "Are you sure about that?" "I don't know what you're getting at," I said, trying to sound calm. "You don't?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the table. "Phone logs," he said. 2 years' worth. My heart stopped. Mark's voice remained calm, but his words were anything but. "I've gone through every call, every text. Do you know what I found? A pattern. Wednesday mornings, Friday afternoons, always to the same number. Would you like to guess whose number it is?" I couldn't breathe, let alone answer. "It's Daniel's," he continued, his tone sharper now. "Your trainer. Or should I say, our trainer. The man you encouraged me to work with while you—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "It wasn't like that," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Then tell me," he said, leaning forward. "Tell me what it was like, Grace. Convince me that those 100+ calls were innocent." Tears welled up in my eyes. "It was a mistake," I said, barely able to get the words out. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice laced with anger. A mistake is forgetting to turn off the oven. A mistake is losing your keys. What you did was deliberate. I broke down, sobbing into my hands. I was lonely, I admitted. You were so focused on the diet, on the milestones. I felt invisible. Invisible, he snapped, his voice rising. You mean while I was starving myself, killing myself to make you happy? You mean that invisible? I didn't mean to hurt you, I pleaded. But you did, he said, standing now. You didn't just hurt me, Grace. You destroyed us. I looked up at him, desperate to salvage what was left. We can fix this, I said. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't leave me. Mark shook his head, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Fix this, he repeated. You can't fix trust once it's gone, Grace, and you've taken it all. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his decision. What happens now is that I file for divorce, he said. I can't stay married to someone I don't trust. It's over. His words hit me like a blow to the chest. Please, Mark, I begged. I love you. I didn't mean for this to happen. Love, he said, his voice bitter. You don't love me, Grace. You loved controlling me, molding me into what you wanted. And when that wasn't enough, you turned to him. I couldn't respond. I had no defense, no excuse that would undo the damage I'd done. Mark walked away, leaving me alone at the table with the stack of papers, the evidence of my betrayal. My heart ached with regret, but deep down I knew I'd lost him. And this time, there was no coming back. The house felt like a graveyard after Mark left the dining table that night. The air was heavy with unspoken words, accusations, and the weight of a marriage that had crumbled beyond repair. He had always been a man of action, not words. And now I knew his silence was more dangerous than any argument. The days that followed were agonizing. Mark avoided me, spending most of his time locked in the office or leaving the house without explanation. When he was home, he kept his distance, his expression unreadable. The man I had spent a decade building a life with was now a stranger, and I couldn't stop blaming myself. On Wednesday, I found him packing a bag. Where are you going? I asked, my voice shaking. To clear my head, he replied without looking at me. For how long? As long as it takes. And just like that, he was gone. No further explanation, no assurance that he'd come back. The silence he left behind was suffocating. Desperate for answers, I tried calling him, but every call went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he meeting someone? Was he filing for divorce already? The thought of losing him for good sent me spiraling into panic. By Friday morning, I was a wreck. I barely slept, barely ate, and couldn't stop replaying our last conversation in my mind. That afternoon, I received a text from Janine, my beautician, confirming my appointment. It was supposed to be part of my plan to distract Mark with a new look, but now it felt like a cruel reminder of how far I'd fallen. As I sat in the salon, Janine chatted about mundane things, but I could hardly focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to Mark. Where was he? What was he doing? The uncertainty was driving me mad. When I returned home later that day, the house was still empty. For hours I paced the living room, hoping he'd walk through the door. Finally, just after sunset, he arrived. Mark was calm, too calm. He walked in with a bag of takeout, set it on the counter, and turned to me with a look that sent a chill down my spine. We need to talk, he said. I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming. We sat in the living room, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. "I've spent the last few days thinking," Mark began, his voice steady. "About us. About everything that's happened. Mark, He held up a hand, silencing me. "Let me finish." I swallowed hard, nodding. "I've been gathering evidence," he continued. "Phone logs, messages, even recordings." My heart sank. "I didn't want to believe it," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. But the more I dug, the more obvious it became. "You didn't just make a mistake, Grace. You made a choice. Over and over again." Tears streamed down my face as he spoke. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked. "It's not the betrayal. It's that you used me. You let me think this was about my health, about saving our marriage, when really it was just an excuse to do what you wanted." "That's not true," I said weakly. "Isn't it?" he shot back. "You didn't just cheat, Grace. You lied, manipulated, and humiliated me. And now I don't even know who you are anymore." I couldn't look at him. The weight of my actions was unbearable. "I loved you," he said, his voice breaking. "I would have done anything for you. But now, I can't even look at you without feeling disgusted." "Mark, please," I begged. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." He shook his head. "It's too late, Grace. The damage is done." He stood, pulling a folder from his bag. "These are divorce papers," he said, placing them on the coffee table. "Sign them whenever you're ready." I stared at the folder, unable to comprehend what was happening. Mark turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You should know," he said. "Daniel won't be a problem anymore." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say he won't be training anyone for a while." And with that, he was gone. The days that followed were a blur of regret and despair. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. When I finally worked up the courage to check the papers, I saw that everything was already in motion. He had made up his mind. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned what happened to Daniel. Rumors swirled that he had been attacked, beaten so badly that he was unrecognizable. Mark denied any involvement, but I couldn't ignore the timing. Now, as I sit in this empty house, surrounded by the ruins of our marriage, I realize I've lost everything. Not just Mark, but the life we built together. And the worst part? I have no one to blame but myself. The house was unbearably quiet after Mark left. I sat in the living room for hours, staring at the divorce papers he had left on the coffee table. My hands trembled as I touched the folder, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. It felt too final, too real. Mark's absence wasn't just physical. It was like the soul of our home had been ripped away, leaving behind only emptiness. In the days that followed, I barely ate or slept. Every corner of the house reminded me of him, of us, of what I had destroyed. I replayed his words over and over in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. He was right. I had used him, manipulated him, and taken him for granted. And now I was alone, drowning in the consequences of my choices. A week passed before I gathered the courage to reach out to him. I called, texted, even wrote a letter, but there was no response. Mark had cut me off completely, and it was the most excruciating silence I had ever endured. Then came the rumors about Daniel. At first, I didn't believe it. How could I? But the whispers were too consistent to ignore. He'd been beaten, hospitalized, and his career was in ruins. I knew Mark well enough to know he wasn't a violent man, but the timing was impossible to dismiss. Was this his way of exacting revenge? I felt a pang of guilt for Daniel, but it was overshadowed by my own despair. Every day, I sank deeper into regret, replaying every moment that had led to this point. I thought about how I had pushed Mark away, how I had taken his love and turned it into something conditional, transactional. And now I had nothing. One day, I received a letter from Mark. My heart raced as I tore it open, desperate for some shred of hope. But his words were cold, detached. He explained that the divorce was final, and that he hoped I would move on with my life, as he planned to do the same. He didn't blame me outright. He didn't have to. The absence of anger in his words was more painful than any accusation. I fell into a routine of solitude, work, home, bed, each day blending into the next. My friends tried to reach out, but I pushed them away. I couldn't face their pity, couldn't bear to see the judgment in their eyes. Months passed, and I heard through mutual friends that Mark had adopted 2 golden retrievers. The thought of him finding joy in something as simple as a pair of dogs broke me in ways I hadn't expected. He was moving on, finding happiness, while I was stuck in the wreckage of what I had done. I tried to distract myself by diving into work, taking on extra projects and staying late at the office. But no amount of busyness could fill the void Mark had left behind. Every night I returned to an empty house, my thoughts haunted by the life we could have had if I had just been better. One evening, I decided to write him a letter. It wasn't an attempt to win him back. I knew that door was closed, but I needed him to know how deeply sorry I was. I poured my heart onto the page, confessing every fear, every insecurity that had driven me to make the choices I had made. I told him how much I had loved him, how I still loved him, and how I hoped he could find the happiness he deserved. I mailed the letter the next morning, unsure if he would even read it. But sending it felt like a small step toward redemption, a way to unburden myself of the guilt that had consumed me. Weeks passed with no response. I didn't expect one, but a part of me still hoped. Then, one afternoon, I saw him. I was walking through the park, trying to clear my mind, when I spotted him in the distance. He was sitting on a bench, laughing as his 2 dogs bounded around him. But he wasn't alone. A woman sat next to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She was beautiful, radiant even, and the way they looked at each other made my heart ache. I stood there frozen, watching as they played with the dogs and shared quiet laughter. It was clear that Mark had moved on, that he had found someone who made him happy in a way I never could. I wanted to run, to hide, but I forced myself to stay. This was the closure I needed, the final confirmation that Mark's life was better without me. As I turned to leave, Mark looked up and saw me. For a moment, our eyes met, and I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, of something unspoken. But he didn't call out to me, and I didn't approach him. Instead, I walked away, tears streaming down my face, knowing that it was truly over. That night, I packed up the last of Mark's things and left them on the porch for him to collect. I couldn't keep holding on to the past. It was time to let go, to accept the consequences of my actions, and try to rebuild my life, even if it would never feel whole again. Mark had found his redemption. Now, it was up to me to find mine. Life after Mark was a haze of emptiness and regret. Days turned into weeks, then months, and I remained trapped in the endless cycle of replaying my mistakes. I couldn't stop wondering what my life could have been if I had chosen differently, if I hadn't been so selfish, so blind. I'd lost him. There was no denying that. The divorce papers were signed, and Mark had moved out, taking only the essentials. Our home felt like a hollow shell, filled with echoes of a life we once shared. I tried to move on, but it felt impossible. Every step I took reminded me of the weight of my choices. Then one fateful day, everything changed. I had decided to get out of the house for a while, tired of the walls closing in around me. I went to the dog park. It was ironic, really. I wasn't much of a dog person, but I needed fresh air and distraction. As I wandered aimlessly, I spotted two golden retrievers playing in the distance. My heart clenched. And then I saw him. Mark stood at the edge of the park, throwing a ball for the dogs to chase. He looked different. Lighter somehow. Happier. He was laughing, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I let myself believe I was dreaming. But it wasn't just Mark. Next to him was a woman. A beautiful, vibrant woman who radiated warmth. She leaned close to him, her hand brushing his arm as they talked. The way he looked at her made my chest tighten. I had once been the person who brought him that kind of joy. But now I was just a stranger standing in the distance. I froze, unable to look away. The dogs bounded back to Mark, tails wagging, and the woman laughed, as one of them nearly knocked her over. Mark reached out instinctively, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. The tenderness in that simple gesture was enough to shatter me. He had moved on. My feet felt like lead, but I forced myself to turn and walk away. I couldn't stay. Watching him be happy without me was like pouring salt on an open wound. But as I took a step, something made me glance back. Mark was looking at me. Our eyes met. And for a split second, the world seemed to stand still. His expression was unreadable. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. I wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize again, but the words caught in my throat. He didn't approach me, and I didn't move closer. Instead, he gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a goodbye. I nodded back, tears blurring my vision, and turned away for the last time. That night, I sat alone in the house that no longer felt like home. For the first time in months, I didn't cry. Instead, I sat in silence, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. Mark had found his happiness. He had found someone who loved him the way I should have. Someone who appreciated the man he was without trying to change him. And though it hurt, I knew it was for the best. I needed to move on. The next morning, I started packing. The house was too much. A constant reminder of what I had lost. I decided to sell it and move somewhere new. Somewhere I could start fresh. As I packed, I found a photo of Mark and me from our honeymoon. We were on the beach, smiling at the camera. The sun setting behind us. I held it for a long time before finally placing it in a box labeled Memories. Mark deserved his happiness, and now it was up to me to find mine. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Mark and the woman from the park, Sophia, were getting serious. It stung, but I was genuinely happy for him. He had always been a good man, and he deserved a love that brought him peace. As for me, I was learning to live again. I moved into a smaller apartment, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even adopted a rescue dog, a scrappy little terrier named Max. He wasn't much, but he was mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. I still thought about Mark, of course. I always would, but I had finally accepted that some mistakes couldn't be undone, and some love stories weren't meant to last forever. Life goes on, even after heartbreak. And though my path was different from what I had imagined, I was determined to make the most of it. Because if Mark could find happiness again, so could I.